Welcome back to High Side, Low Side. This is episode 6 of season 8. I am your host, Spurgeon Dunbar. This is, of course, Zach Quartz sitting across the screen from me. Today's episode, we are joined by the one and only Peter Egan. I cannot wait. But before we jump into that, we've got things to talk about. Things like Moto America Racing. We're going to talk about anti-theft precautions you can take with your motorcycle. And first and foremost, a word from our sponsor.
That's right. Time to give a tip of the cap to our friends at Motul for sponsoring High Side, Low Side. It is April when this podcast has come out, which means if your bike isn't ready to ride this summer, it should be by now. And if you still need to do an oil change, we do hope you'll consider Motul engine oil, whether you have an American V-twin, a Japanese inline 4, or anything in between. You can head over to Revzilla.com/Motul to shop all of Motul's products. And when you purchase something, keep in mind you're supporting this High Side, Low Side podcast.
And if you're also looking for other deals to help you gear up for the riding season, you can check out Revzilla's RPM program. That stands for Riders Preferred Membership. The name has changed, but the deals are all there for you to take advantage of. Learn more about Revzilla's RPM program at Revzilla.com/RPM. But for now, on with the show.
Okie dokie, Spurge, here we go, off on another High Side, Low Side adventure. Another hour or two of words that we say being carved in stone on the internet forever, and we're hopefully not going to regret any of them.
We've been doing this for 8 seasons now, and this is easily the most nervous I've ever been. So I'm throwing that out there before we jump into Not the News and start talking about Moto America Racing.
That's fair. And before we get to your jangling nerves, we should cover our Not the News topic, which is what's new with Moto America. Those not familiar, Moto America is the American domestic superbike and supersport racing series. And there's some shakeups, some things going on in the series. And we thought we would just sort of throw a quick spotlight on that in case you're not familiar.
Yep. So we're going to take 3 minutes with the timer starting now. And we're going to walk through some notes and remind everybody that there is also an article over on Common Tread that Lance penned, which is a Moto America 2024 season preview. So if you're not into racing and you want to learn the basics, you can always check that out over on Common Tread. So as Zach mentioned, there is a superbike class, a super sport class, and most notably, as of recent, a King of the Baggers class, which is large American V-twin bagger motorcycles racing around the track. And this weekend actually marks the first time King of the Baggers is showing up at MotoGP. Is that correct, Zach?
I believe so, yeah. King of the Baggers will be a support class at MotoGP, which means, all of these people from around the world will come to Texas and they will see Americans riding around. I mean, not exclusively Americans, but this American racing series with Harley Davidsons and Indians with saddlebags on them and slick tires racing around at gobsmacking speeds. I'm really hoping that we can see some of the faces on the engineers and mechanics from, whatever, Spain and Argentina and Thailand and stuff when they're like, what are these people doing? Anyway, it is a spectacle. It is quite exciting. And of course, as we may have mentioned on the podcast before, Revzilla is sponsoring a King of the Baggers team, so you can root for the the bike with Revzilla painted on the side. The other interesting stuff that's going on in Moto America that I'd like to touch on right quick is some sort of new teams and interesting sort of developments in the class. Most notably, I think, is Graham Rahal. Rahal Racing is a sort of a historically a four-wheeled team. It's a famous racing family. They've dived into sponsoring a two-wheeled team, and they have good riders, including an exciting young lady by the name of Kaylee Yakov, who is quite articulate and seems like a really cool person, and also very, very fast on a motorcycle. The other things that are kind of interesting, I think, you have Loris Baz, French ex-MotoGP racer who's come to join Josh Herron on the Ducati Superbike team racing in Moto America. So there's lots of sort of international and even four-wheel interest, you might say, in Moto America this year. Not that international riders are foreign to Moto America. It's not that this is the first time that has happened, but it's cool. There's sort of there's a little bit of crackle and sort of life in the series this year from my perspective, and I'm excited about it.
So then my question for you, Zach, for audience members that might be listening that aren't really familiar, can you give us just we kind of defined King of the Baggers class.
Yes.
There's a Twins Cup class. Is
Yes.
and that's different than the Super Sport class, which is then different. So what's for the three other classes there? Like, just give us the bikes that people would see, or the types of bikes people would see.
As far as I understand it, there is a Superbike class, a Super Stock class, and a Super Sport class. Those classes all.
I'm going to let you finish. The timer's up, but I'm going to let you finish your answer. Yes.
All those classes follow World Superbike rules, basically, so that there's a sort of like easier way to track which bikes are which. And then, there's a Twins Cup class, which is sort of a development class, which is your sort of SV650s, your Aprilia RS660s, your Yamaha R7, stuff like that. The bikes are a little bit slower, a little bit less powerful. There's often younger riders trying to make a name for themselves in that class, and including Suzuki's, as for bikes, that is, including Suzuki's new GSX-8R, which there'll be a couple teams running that bike, but also the Revzilla team, which is exciting. And then, of course, the King of the Baggers, which is pretty. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You will recognize it when you see it. Anyway,
we've talked about that before, because you got a chance to ride a King of the Baggers bike. Like,
True.
This is something that we've been talking about on the podcast even before today. So
yes, if you'd like a sort of bizarro introduction, baptism into King of the Baggers racing, you could go over to the Revzilla YouTube channel and watch yours truly wobble around a track on one. It was quite the experience.
Or if you want a more overview of an introduction other than Zach just riding one, Lance does a great job. Check out his Moto America 2024 season preview article. He also has season preview articles for World Superbike as well as MotoGP. So if you're interested in getting into racing, Lance does a good job of breaking it down, so even a layman like myself can understand what someone like Zach is talking about. So,
well, speaking of mere mortals reading about their heroes, Virgin, we're about to invite Peter Egan onto the podcast, and I would just like to know if, how are you feeling right now?
Feeling?
Since the surprise at the end of last time's show.
I told Chase before we started this that if I get through this without choking up at some point, I'm going to be surprised, because I'm almost choking up now just talking about the fact that I might choke up while we do this. But yeah.
High side, low side, everybody, where people's dreams come true. And by people, I mean Spurgeon Dunbar.
So in all joking aside, not that I was joking about how choked up I'm going to be, I did want to give an introduction to people. I think that while there's a lot of people out there that listen to this podcast that know who Peter is, that know about his work, I think there's probably a lot of people that don't. And I think that it's really important to note that this is someone that I think really kind of spans multi-generations, but I don't want to waste any of my ramblings here. I've actually prepared something, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to say this concisely. So if you, the high side, low side listeners, will indulge me for a minute,
sure.
I'm gonna read a little introduction that I prepared. Let's
start the 3-minute timer, just in case this gets out of hand.
So on paper, Peter Egan is best known as a columnist and writer for Cycle World magazine, or Road and Track if you're into cars. He's ridden hundreds, if not thousands, of motorcycles. He's restored everything from 50cc scooters that he pulled out of a dumpster to rare vintage treasures that he lusted over for years. And he's had more adventures on two wheels than most of us will ever have in a lifetime, with or without wheels. His work has been compared to Mark Twain and Jane Austen. Well, I think the average moto-journalist considers himself lucky if they get compared to Peter. But beyond his editor-at-large title, Peter is an enthusiast who managed to inspire everyone from fellow enthusiasts to new riders. And after all, who's more enthusiastic about riding a motorcycle than someone doing it for the first time? Peter is one of us. Or more arguably, or more accurately, Peter is the version of ourselves that we always hoped to be. Through his stories, we can imagine ourselves in his shoes, but in reality, his shoes are just too big for us to fill. I was introduced to Peter's work in the spring of 2005. My dad gave me a copy of a Cycle World magazine and suggested that I read a column. The column was titled Leanings. And in this column, the magazine itself was actually from the year prior. My dad doesn't throw away magazines. That's an entirely other podcast. But the article romanticized the quintessential motorcycle road trip, and it culminated with Peter's purchase of a 2004 Triumph Bonneville T100. High side, low side listeners should be aware that 3 months later, I purchased a 2005 Triumph Bonneville T100 and became one of my main modes of transportation that I still own to this day. Well, it was Peter's writing that pushed me over the edge from a passive observer to a motorcycle owner. I was also one of the fortunate ones. My dad and my Uncle Bob had already planted the fundamental seed of interest in the world of motorcycling in me at a very young age. But what about all the people out there that don't have a Spurgeon Sr. or an Uncle Bob in their life? For so many, Peter was, through his writing, the surrogate father or the crazy uncle whose house you couldn't wait to visit on summer break and whose stories you've heard 1,000 times, but yet you beg to hear them again. So for those of you out there that are listening to High Side, Low Side that know him, our hope is that the topics that Zack and I picked today will just offer a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at the man behind the articles that we all know and love. And for those of you that are meeting him for the first time, well, we hope that this episode serves as an introduction to the man whose work will hopefully spark inspiration in you as well. Inspiration to take a trip, to buy a basket case motorcycle, or to simply ignite a spark into a flame that pushes you over the edge to give motorcycling a try as well. The same way his work ignited that spark in me 20 years ago. So without any further ado, I'm going to get to meet Peter Egan.
I was kidding about the 3-minute timer, but I guess I shouldn't have been.
The timer didn't go off. I'm under 3 minutes according to Chase's timer.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. That is a lovely little introduction and synopsis of Peter's impact on your life, and hopefully a good sort of whetting of the whistle for all the High Side, Low Side listeners.
Now we just have to live up to the expectations and do a good interview.
Hopefully Peter doesn't have high expectations of us. That would be a real bummer. But we'll find out.
Let's get him on. Let's get him on this show. Let's do this. Whew.
Hi, Spurg. How are you?
Before you came on, I gave a bit of an introduction. I joked about the fact that I was going to try and not get emotional, but I think even just kind of seeing this, this is something that has been very exciting me. When Zack told me that the two of you had kind of conspired this whole thing. You're somebody that's been a huge influence in so much of my life, and I'm excited to introduce you to the High Side, Low Side audience, but also selfishly, I'm just excited to have, you as an audience for the questions and get to have this conversation. So thank you for all that you've done, but also thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I always enjoy your discussions, and I saw one a while back where you said, you would like to take a ride sometime with me, and I said to my friends, "Does he know how overrated that is?" Anyway,
well, I think that's the pinnacle goal, and I can offer you. I actually am friends with a bunch of the guys that work behind the scenes at Martin Guitars too. So if you ever wanted to do a ride to the Martin Guitar Factory, I can get you into the hidden back rooms where all the secrets lie.
Great. Yeah, I went there a long time ago on a car trip, and I think Chris Martin was there. I don't know if he still is, but he was. I was on a car trip with my friend Chris Beebe. We were in a Healy 3000 or 104 actually, and Nazareth was our peak point on the trip, so we had to stop in. We're both Martin guitar owners, so.
Yeah, no, Chris, for those of you listening that don't know, Chris Martin was the CEO. Chris actually just stepped down, but you're in good company because there's a bunch of guys working there right now that are avid motorcyclists, KTM, Ducati, Moto Guzzi owners, and that's the circle that I've kind of befriended myself with within the higher ranks over there.
Yeah, it's amazing how many guitar players are motorcycle buffs. My brother's in the music business, and he said he used to interview rock and roll bands on the radio, and he said virtually every one of them had, three. If there were a group of four, they would have 3 motorcycles in the group. And,
yeah,
common gene or something.
Well, I promised Zach that I would save all of our guitar conversation for a separate phone call so that we didn't bore him. But I did want to kick off a question. So this is kind of like just a fun one that we wanted to throw out there. Before I jump into these podcasts, I hype myself up with different music, and I kind of sat down this morning, and the music and the record that I picked out to listen to while preparing to interview you was Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers. In my opinion, I think it's probably the pinnacle of Rolling Stones music. I think Exile on Main Street gets a lot of, clout because of the allure behind it. But to me, from a tight, punctuated album, that was one that I used to hype myself up coming into this. So my question is, if you were going to sit down with yourself and talk to yourself, what record would you listen to hype yourself up?
Well, that would be one of them. We have a garage band, and we play a lot of Rolling Stones. And I actually have I've got a Telecaster that I've got tuned to open G with 5 strings on it, so I can play Honky Tonk Women and Stone songs. So that would be a good choice for me too.
Do you have the PAF replica pickup in the bridge?
I did. That one was stolen. I'm looking for another one right now. About 5 years ago, somebody broke into our workshop and took all my guitars. And
oh no!
Yeah, luckily they were covered by insurance. They never found the person, but I had a humbucker in the neck position on one of my Telecasters. So.
That's literally I don't know what's worse of a fear for me is somebody stealing all of my guitars or all of my motorcycles, but I think they're both right up there in like the fears that keep me up at night, because insurance money can only replace so much. I think so much of what we talk about, whether it's motorcycles or other items, it's the emotional attachment that sometimes comes with them.
Yeah, you make a lot of trips to dealerships and music stores and so on before you pick one out, and it's a lot of lost time when somebody takes the one you had your eye on.
Zach, I'll let you move on to get us out. If you don't stop us right now, this is going to keep going. So,
right. Hi, Peter. I'm Zach, by the way. Very, very nice to meet you. Spurg and I'm actually a former sort of quasi-colleague, having worked for Motorcyclist Magazine under the same umbrella as Cycle World at some point. So worked with some of the folks that you worked with at that point. I'm fairly certain I did not absorb any of your talents when I did that, but
oh no,
I appreciate the connection that we have in our work history anyway.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm sorry to hear about your guitars getting stolen and that they never caught the person. It's going to be really awkward when you go to Spurgeon's house and he has all of your old guitars, don't you think? That would be that would be really unfortunate.
I suspected. I gave his phone number to the police, but
right on. Well, he did just recently purchase a new house and is moving, so maybe this has something to do with the Grand Theft guitar.
Yeah, I need all the extra room.
Right. Well, so yeah, as much fun as it is to see you guys glow over guitars, we probably should talk about motorcycles at some point. And we prepared a bunch of questions for you, as you probably imagine. We'd like to tell you that please feel free to turn these questions back at us. Feel free to call us out if we say anything that sounds stupid. We want this to be as much as a sort of a in the garage with the boys conversation as much as it can be, and not so much an interview. We want you to feel comfortable doing that as much as you can.
Okay, well, you tell me to stop too if I get running on too long with something.
No worries at all. So the first, we have got a bit of a backstory, which we'll get to, but we'd like to know the story of your first motorcycle. What was your first motorcycle, and how did you come by it?
Well, the first motorcycle I had, I couldn't ride really. I bought an old James for $30. It was a British motor with a Villiers 125 or 150 engine. I'm not sure. I kept trying to measure the displacement. It didn't have a title or any numbers on it, so I was always trying to figure out if I had a 150 or 125. But anyway, I got it running. It was sitting behind somebody's house, and after I got it running, it would idle and sort of putt down the street, but it wouldn't accelerate. And then I took the carburetor apart and found out somebody had taken all the jets out of it. So it was essentially running flooded carburetor all the time. And I tried to find out where I could get jets for this antique. It was probably an early AML of some kind, and nobody knew that in my small hometown. So I sold it to another kid for $30, and I think he put it he put it behind another barn and left it. But I almost bought a Harley WLA for my first bike. There was a guy who ran a gas station in Union Center, which was about 3 miles from our town, and he had he wanted I think he wanted $100 for a World War II WLA Harley.
Right. So that's the WLA was the Army bike, right?
Yeah, Army bike,
the twin Army bike. Okay.
Drab, and except somebody had painted the whole thing with primer, so the tires were primer and everything. Seat, but anyway, I took that for a ride, and I was still underage. And so I rode it around a big field behind the gas station. And as I pulled up behind the garage, I bumped into an oil drum and tipped the bike over briefly. And by the time the owner ran back around the corner, I'd picked the bike up. And so I said, well, I'm going to buy this. So I went home to get the money, and I came back, and he had changed his mind. So I bought a Bridgestone 50. It was a Bridgestone 7 by Rockford, it was called. Our local hardware store became a Bridgestone dealer. He had one in the front window. We were all lusting after it. And so I went from a 45-inch Harley to a 50cc Bridgestone, which was brand new. I had to get a bank loan to get that for $100, and I think it was $270 or something like that. And my dad, I would have to get a second job on the weekends if I wanted to buy that to pay off the loan. So I got a job mowing the Catholic cemetery. Used to ride stone out there and mow the cemetery at night, and then sit back and smoke a cigarette that my parents didn't know about and look at my bike, lean on a stone.
That's terrific. Well, so this brings us to our backstory, which is that we did a trivia episode recently where we had a third party. We had a guest, less distinguished guest than yourself, but come on and ask us questions, motorcycle trivia questions, in the hopes that it would spur conversation and sort of educate the audience to some extent. At some point, there was a question about which of these companies actually produced motorcycles, and Bridgestone was on the list. And Spurgeon, I'll let you take it from here, Spurge. Spurge knew the answer because of you, Peter.
Yeah, so it was a list of all British or all Japanese tire manufacturers, and it was which previous tire manufacturer also produced motorcycles. And the only reason I knew the answer was because I knew that the Bridgestone 50. I read an article once where you talked about riding the lawnmower around at night to afford a Bridgestone 50, and so I won that episode. I have a trophy sitting on my desk because that was the one question that put me over the top of answering ahead of Zach.
Only a few of us know it. It's that's good. Yeah, that Bridgestone didn't stay in business a long time after that. They made some pretty nice bikes. They had a 350 that was very quick, and all of a sudden they just disappeared from the market. I don't know what the reasons were behind it, but it was a pretty good bike, really. It's pretty quick for a 50. Nice.
So, I recall I did some my dad raced vintage motorcycles, actually sort of still does, and that's where I grew up, in vintage road racing paddock, and I remember a couple of Bridgestones puttering around. So that was sort of like the little nugget of information I had in my head. Fun fact, I don't know if you knew this, Peter, that I did not know, was that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Spurge, but didn't we learn that the name Bridgestone came from the fellow who founded the company? His last name was in Japanese translated to Stonebridge. And he just figured, we'll just I'll just kind of flip it around and we'll call it Bridgestone, which I thought was fascinating. I didn't have any idea.
There aren't big volumes of history of Bridgestone motorcycles like there are Honda or something, but
right.
I didn't realize that the importer in this area was in Rockford, Illinois, and so I still have my owner's manual, and it says Bridgestone 7 by Rockford. And so I thought, well, maybe this is made in Rockford, but of course it wasn't. It was made in Japan.
Well, it's interesting because it was such a different era where, you know, the ways of importing motorcycles have changed so much, you know, over the past 50 or 60 years, that those little importers used to be the way that, you know, bikes came into the country, and it's obviously shifted a lot, which we'll kind of hit on with some of the questions we have here. But before we move on, one of the questions that I did have for you is, I think a lot of people recognize you as a car enthusiast or a motorcycle enthusiast, or, you know, even to maybe a lesser extent, a plane enthusiast, you know. But what came first? Like, your love of writing as an author, or your love of machinery and going faster than your feet could take you? What was the catalyst for you of the two?
I don't know. When you're a kid, you don't think much about writing, but I read a lot, and I was a big airplane buff. When I was a kid, I had lots of model airplanes and hanging from my ceiling. I think I made one Revell model of every airplane ever made, a couple of balsa wood planes and so on. So I was interested in airplanes, and nobody in my family was interested in cars or car performance or motorcycles at all. And something just kicked in when I was about 12 years old. I really started paying attention to motorcycles and racing cars. I picked up a car magazine for a friend of mine, and it was a road and track magazine and a sports car graphic. And I read both of those. And at the time, I was also reading Karting magazine. I built a couple of go-karts myself when I was in 7th and 8th grade. And I was always tuning stroke engines and trying to get welding done at the local welding shop and that kind of thing. And so it all fit. I don't know. It was all the same thing at one time. I spent part of the time working at an airport to buy the motorcycle. So they're all just, you know, they all have that allure of going somewhere that's a little bit different or a little harder or a little more interesting than just driving.
And
you know,
but your background, correct me but your background, you went to school for an English major, so you knew that at some point you wanted to pursue writing as a career path?
I did. I started school at the University of Wisconsin as a journalism major, and then after a couple of years, I'd pretty much taken all the writing courses and so on, and I made the dreadful mistake in my middle of my junior year of deciding I needed to be a doctor. And so I suddenly dropped journalism and took all these pre-med courses. And I realized about 6 weeks into a physics course and a biochem course that I was going to get a D- in both classes, and I would never get into medical school anywhere. So I got up out of a chem lab one day and walked down State Street in Madison and joined the Army. And my parents were completely, what would the British say, gobsmacked. But anyway, when I went back to school, I went to Vietnam. After I got back, I finished up in journalism because that's what I really wanted to do. But I pictured myself being a war correspondent or something, you know, just having a couple of Nikons jumping out of helicopters and that kind of thing. So
interesting. So
journalism.
To circle back to that a little bit, I think it's totally understandable that you say you're sort of like more interested in you know, things that went fast or flew in the sky when you were a kid than putting words together. That's pretty understandable. Do you recall a moment when you wrote something for the first time and sort of either enjoyed it or thought, that was actually pretty good, or I don't know, where you sort of like you felt like the hook was really set for writing, or was it always just sort of a thing that you fell backwards into? I
think I got good feedback once in a while from teachers.
Okay.
Or they would read, if we had to write an essay on something, they would say this was good, or they would read it to the class or something. So once in a while, I lucked out with an essay question, and so I ran into that a little bit in English in school. But my parents owned a small town newspaper as well, and I spent most of my childhood just printing, really running printing presses and cleaning the presses and oiling things. But I didn't do much writing for the paper because my mom and dad both wrote for the paper. And my grandfather, after he retired, did a column every month for the paper.
So
but short news reports that I wrote for the paper.
So it's genetic to some extent. It sounds like you have some kind of family history. It's like learning when there's a fabulous baseball pitcher or something like that, and then you learn that his grandfather played in the majors and his dad played in the majors and his uncle played in the majors, and you think, okay, well that sort of makes sense. So you had a similar kind of thing. Like you're a widely published author, but you have it in the background of your family as well.
Yeah, I tell people that it was hard to get away with a grammatical error at our table on a Sunday dinner because my grandparents were there and sitting with three people who wrote columns for the paper. And my grandfather, my mother's dad, was German, and he had learned English as a second language, but he spoke it. He had that German perfection where he could spot a grammatical error a mile away and wince. He spoke German and English, I think, perfectly. So,
right. That's so interesting. That's like, sorry, Spurge, but that's like, I feel like I'm looking in the mirror to some extent. My father-in-law is Hungarian, and came from Hungary via Sweden, so he speaks Swedish and Hungarian. But his grasp on the English language is frustratingly tight, and I think he even owns a coffee mug that says "I'm silently correcting your grammar" on the side of it. And so I also, as a quote unquote writer, I have to be very cautious with my grammar as well. And it's pretty embarrassing to be a 40-year-old professional and be corrected by your father-in-law. But such is my life.
Had that mug from my grandfather. He came over from Germany already speaking English pretty well, but he met my grandmother because he was in New York, in Brooklyn, and he was taking a course on how to lose your German accent or whatever accent you've got and speak. He was a pharmaceutical salesman and research. He did some research as well, but he met my grandmother teaching, which was kind of funny because she had a Brooklyn accent. She was trying to teach him to speak. He didn't learn it exactly the way we would have in, say, Minnesota or Wisconsin. He didn't have that Midwestern thing. But
right, fair enough. Yeah, Spurge, I just want to ask one more question on the writing topic, since I'm fully in geek mode now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is an annoying question, Peter, but we had it written down, and I can't help but, since we have you as a captive here on the podcast, but ask you. The question goes something like this. You arrive at the pearly gates, your time as an earthly being has come to an end. And when you get there, St. Peter says, what's the finest piece of writing you've ever done, Peter Egan? What do you tell him? What's your answer there? Do you have anything that springs to mind as a sort of opus that you're particularly proud of?
I don't know. Some things work better than others. I worked for a very long time on the first story that I sold to Cycle World, and it still reads okay to me because I was trying to get published, and I just wrote it over and over again and kept eliminating anything that didn't work for me and so on. And it was actually rejected by one of the motorcycle magazines, and I got very depressed. And my friend Lee Hagelin said, "Why don't you send it to a different magazine?" And I said, well, I sent it to a magazine that mostly does touring stories, and they rejected it. And they said they needed spectacular photos or they couldn't use it. And all I had was a few snapshots. And so I said, well, what about the other magazines? And I said, well, there's Cycle and Cycle World are the big ones. And Cycle World occasionally does a touring story. And he said, well, send it to them. And so I did. And luckily, it was good timing because Alan Girdler had just come on board, and he liked it and sent me a nice note and said, "We like the story, and we're going to publish it. And if you have anything else, send it to us." So that it was quite a celebration that night when I got that letter in the mail. So.
And what I would say is you couldn't have picked a better transition, because the article that I believe you're talking about was Dateline Missoula, if I am correct. And the final question that I had for you was, when you wrote your first book, Leanings, which is a collection of all your work, that's actually the first article in the book. And what I loved was you gave little insights about the story before the reader got a chance to read it. And, one of the things that you talked about was that at that point, you were trying for 10 years to get published. You'd been working at this, and your day job is an auto mechanic, and you were feeling discouraged. So I guess my question out of all of that you just said is, a lot has changed over the past 45 or 50 years. Zach and I get questions a lot about like, oh, I want to write for a motorcycle publication. Like, what advice would you give someone that wants to do what you did? I mean, obviously there was no instant gratification. You spent time rewriting and rewriting to get published. And when it finally happened, it probably felt so good, but what would your advice be to somebody out there that wants to do what you do?
I don't know. It's changed so much. It's, I really had very good luck in timing. I came in at a time when the magazines were big and there was a lot of advertising on paper in magazines, and the Cycle World and Road and Track were both owned by CBS magazines at the time, and they had very good managerial people running the magazines and trying to improve the quality. And so it was everything was up at that time. And to me, the magazine business is a little like music. You have to find a specialty and make your way with it. But I don't know what I would do to repeat what I did with the magazines, because it's not the same world anymore. It's like getting a book published or something. It's, I don't know what I would give. I guess just be persistent if you have some idea what you want to do. But I think it is harder now than it was then to get into the business.
Well, I'll tell you what I sort of read into your answer that I really liked, for what it's worth, was the sort of the diligence and the torture that you put yourself through to write that first article. And I would like to say, as a quick sidebar, I love that your answer of, what's your favorite piece of writing was sort of like the one that started this whole thing, which reminds me of a Seinfeld quote about his sitcom where they said, "What's your favorite episode?" And he said each episode always felt like, his analogy was, "What's your favorite breath of air you've ever taken?" And you would say, "Well, the one that I'm taking that gets me to the next one. That's I don't really have like a lineup in my mind of things that were my favorite." And I think it's very poetic that as a creative person, you chose the one that sort of allowed you to do the rest of them, because that ultimately probably felt like the most important one. But I love the struggle that you talked about, because that's something that I think people underappreciate in Spurg and I, in our generation, and especially even younger folks, is the amount of sort of writing that you need to throw away before you get stuff that is actually good.
Yeah,
I think is.
I wrote short stories. Of course, I always thought I was going to get a short story published in Playboy magazine or something, and get $5,000 for it. And I guess I didn't realize that Norman Mailer was also writing for Playboy, and every great American writer was doing short stories. So you didn't really get in there as a rank amateur. But I wrote a couple of books as well, and they came back thud, and then I'd reread them and think, well, that's not good enough anyway. I see why they rejected it. So it's a learning process.
But it gave
Sure.
you an excuse to explain to your parents why you had so many Playboy magazines next to your bed.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, no, those were hidden.
I'm just reading it for the articles, Mom. I promise.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a classic. Well, I guess to pivot away from writing a little bit, because Spurg and I spend some amount of time on the written word, and we do our darndest, but I would say probably most of the high side, low side listeners don't care about writing quite as much as we do. They probably care more about motorcycles. And so I'm curious to ask you a little bit of a philosophical question, which was a topic of a podcast we did. And very broadly, the question was, can a motorcycle be too cheap? Is there such a thing as a motorcycle that is too cheap? And I'm curious what your take is there, Peter. Is that how do you interpret that question, and what do you think your answer is?
I don't know that I've ever put together any connection between the cost of a motorcycle and how much fun I've had with it. I mean, you can get. I used to work with Steve Kimball at Cycle World. He was an engineer, nuclear engineer at one point, and he liked cars as I did. And we were talking about cars, and he said one day, it's interesting. The more you spend on a car, the less reliable it will be. He said, if you buy a hand-built Rolls Royce, you'll probably have more trouble with it than you do with a Toyota Corolla, which was a base car at that time. And
Right.
That's often occurs to me. The more exotic stuff often is beautiful to look at and wonderful to own, but you have to find that balance between reliability, quality, and so on. And right now, one of probably my favorite bike I own is a Royal Enfield Himalayan, which is a not very fast 411cc dual sport bike, but it's perfect for the back roads in Wisconsin. And I've got 11,000 miles on it with no problems. And it's probably the cheapest motorcycle I've ever bought, given inflation and so on. It was less than $5,000. And I've spent more than that on motorcycles that were not as memorable. So I think it's what you have fun riding.
Right.
I haven't really, motorcycle quality is like car quality. It's come up so much. I don't really see off-brand vehicles of any kind that last very long in the market if they don't have a certain reliability and quality to them anymore.
Right.
And
That's
one of the
pretty good way to answer that question. Yeah, I like that.
I love the answer, and I like the fact that you brought up inflation, because one of the questions that I was going to ask later on, and I think it fits in perfectly here, is, oftentimes in your writing you've brought up the old adage of, how much do you pay for a used motorcycle? Well, it's $1 a cc, right? If you're buying a CB 350, you should be able to find one used for around $350. If you're buying a CB 750, you should have to spend around $750 for it. In the modern age, when accounting for inflation, do you have a current rule of thumb for how much you would spend per cc, or is that just completely out the window at this point?
No, I don't think in terms of per cc. I think no, I don't. The thing is, I'm getting older now, and I'm less happy with big, heavy, complex bikes. It's happening to a lot of people my age. I'm 67 years old, and so we all joke every year we like lower and lighter and simpler. And so when I sit on something that's really heavy and complex and expensive to run and expensive to buy, I just say no. This is maybe at one time I would have bought this bike, but not right now. So I don't convert it to dollars per cc. I did buy a bike. I bought a couple of bikes $1 a cc. I had an XL 350 that was my first dirt bike that I rode in the desert in California. When I arrived at Cycle World, I had really not ridden in the dirt at all, and Ron Grivey, who was our dirt bike editor, took me out with a bunch of his friends for this tradition of beating the new guy to death in the desert. And so I realized I had to get my own dirt bike and do some practicing. So I went to Lee Fleming at a Newport Beach motorcycle shop, and I said, I need some kind of a dirt bike, but I don't really want to spend very much right now. And he said, how about this XL 350 over here? It's $1 a cc. And I bought that and rode it for a couple of years in the desert and did Barstow, Vegas twice with it. Very reliable, nice, easy to use bike. And so it worked out well. It was probably the cheapest bike I ever bought that actually runs.
Well,
That's great.
I was going to say my first time riding a dirt bike was it was a similar experience where I had moved to Los Angeles to become a high school teacher, and one of my co-teachers had a bunch of KTMs in the garage, and at that point I had only ridden street, and he's like, well, let's go out and I'll give you like a 525 EXCF and you can ride that. And I was like, great. I mean, it's smaller than my Bonneville. How hard could it be? And I immediately went off the side of a cliff and then down into a berm, and I was just like, this is a completely different world. But it sparked an interest, and it made me realize that if I'm going to keep doing this, I have to own my own, because otherwise you're just going to thrash the hell out of somebody else's motorcycle.
Yeah, I think that's true. I had a KTM 525, by the way, and I think it's probably my favorite dirt bike of all time. I used it to ride out west. We had a bunch of us had a friend out west who used to invite 20 or 25 motorcycling friends out to his ranch in South Dakota, and we had the whole ranch to ride on. He would lead group tours, and not tours really, we just go riding every day. But for all terrain, I think that's the best bike I've had, because it had all this torque. You could motor your way up a really steep hill without having to downshift 3 times. Just would throw rocks, before it would die. And,
what was the name? I remember the article. It was something under the winter moon, or
it was the moon of what was the name of it? It was one of the descriptions of one of the seasons that they used, the Indian tribes, indigenous people used to describe the month. It was something like the cherry or something. I can't remember now.
Yeah, I'll have to find it and put it in the description, because for anyone that wants to read it, I can tell you it was. I remember it was in Leanings 2, which is your second collection of stories, and it was originally published in, I think, a Psycho World Adventure one-off or something like that. But yeah, really interesting story.
Yeah, I went. I tried to retrace the Trail of Tears. Went from my friend's ranch to to its bloody conclusion, and so we followed that whole trail. It was a good trip.
You've always managed to like weave history. I've often felt at times when reading your articles, you manage to do a good job of telling a story that has motorcycles in it, but it's a larger story about history or some other, kind of journey. And I think that's a great example of an article where, you did a great job of telling the history of Native Americans in the Dakotas while also kind of hinting at the fact that you guys were riding around on dirt bikes and dual sports and hanging out at a clubhouse and having a good time.
Yeah. It's well, I think most of us, when we take long trips and rides, have something in the background, some place we want to see historically or some theme in mind, rather than just going off and riding. And with a lot of the stuff I've done, there's a musical background. I want to see where Chuck Berry lives or something, but or go through the Mississippi Delta, see blues country for the first time, that kind of thing. So it's fun to combine motorcycling with something else, some other interest. Maybe if you were a Civil War buff, you'd want to ride to Gettysburg, that kind of thing. But it's nice to have some destination, I think, in the back of your mind, a reason for taking the trip rather than just riding, which we do all the time just for fun. But
yeah. Do you think that I don't want to couch it as sort of simply as like your secret to writing, but do you think I imagine it helps you. It helps in your writing process, in your creative process, to have other things that you're interested in, to use a motorcycle as a vehicle to get to a place, and you ultimately end up talking about that motorcycle. But if you have something else in mind, then the story is more likely to write itself. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, it certainly makes it easier to keep a narrative going, and it's nice to have a theme to the story. And there's real curiosity behind it usually, because it's something I've never seen or never been to, and I'm reacting to it as I go along. And I take notes a lot on trips. It's easier for me to travel alone or with Barb on one motorcycle, because I'll skid to a stop suddenly and whip a notebook out and have what we're seeing or something. And if you're riding with a group, that doesn't work very well. So
right. How do you combat that when you are on a group ride? Like if you're riding with other people and you're thinking, well, I'm going to write a story about this, do you just try harder to remember things, or do you make people suffer through your stops, or
probably forget a few things? It's nice if you can stop. If you see something striking, you can stop and write it down so you don't forget later that afternoon where you were in the morning. And
right. Yeah, understood.
Well, it was actually one of my questions, because one of my favorite articles that you wrote was your trip to Canada, when you and your friend were thinking about, you had some conflict going on in 1967 and you were looking at Canada as maybe a potential, option, but you wrote the article 10 years later. So were you, even in your early days before you were doing this professionally, were you still just taking notes, or did you just have a memory that was that good a decade later on?
I don't think I took any notes on that trip. I took a few pictures, and I might have written a few letters, but it stayed imprinted on my mind pretty much, because my friend Pat Donnelly went with me on that trip, and it was a serious time. We were both wondering about the Vietnam War and if we wanted to live here and so on. And I wanted to go to Canada anyway. I wanted to go to the Gaspé Peninsula and see it, because it's French Canadian, and I had a geology course, and the geology professor had done some oil surveys in that area, and he had pictures of the Gaspé Peninsula coast. And I said, it looks just like France. it's like going to Brittany, and we can do it without getting on an airplane. Let's go to, go to the Gaspé Peninsula. So my buddy Donnelly and I had a Honda CB160, and he borrowed my brother-in-law's 305 Dream. And we made it as far as Montreal before we ran out of money, which is, but it was interesting because we had a little trouble crossing the border. Everybody was checking on your ID and how much money you've got, where you think you're going, and so on, because the U.S., especially customs, were looking for people trying to get out, maybe servicemen leaving the country, or people with criminal records. So they really went through our luggage and made us sit for an hour while they emptied out our shaving kits and all this kind of stuff. It's the first time I ever went through that kind of border hassle.
But all they found was a bunch of Playboy magazines, and they're like, "This guy's good to go."
Well, my parents never found those.
Well, just back to that trip quickly. You were riding from Wisconsin to French Canada, to Montreal, and
yes.
And like how far? That's hundreds of miles, right? Approximately, or how long was your trip going to be ultimately?
Well, it would have been a lot long. We were probably only about halfway there,
right?
But it was probably 800 miles each way on the way we went, and coming back. We went across northern Ontario and then down into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and
right.
So we went there through Chicago. We stopped and stayed with a friend near Chicago, and then we went through Detroit at about midnight and into Canada.
Well, I would just like to pause quickly for any spoiled young folk, including Spurg and myself, who have been on this podcast talking about how big a motorcycle needs to be to go on a tour to cover hundreds of miles. And we on the Revzilla team specifically, we try to make a habit of making trips on small bikes just to show that it can be done. But I just want to call out that you took off on a potentially 1,000, 2,000 mile road trip on a 160cc bike, and probably didn't necessarily think anything of it. So if you have what you think is too small a motorcycle, just know that it's probably not too small. I just want to call that out.
That's a good point. People often say that go anywhere on a 160, and I went to high school when the hero of our class had a Honda 90. We couldn't imagine what a 160 would be like, and so I considered that my first grown-up real motorcycle. I went out and bought a new Bell helmet, 500 TX, and I bought a Bell staff jacket and a leather jacket, piece by piece, because I could wear those on a motorcycle. It didn't look like I was overdressed for what I was doing. It was a real bike.
Right. That's lovely. That's a fun picture for you to paint just in that moment. And I guess if you don't mind, another question that came to mind via a topic that we covered in this podcast about basically dumbest weather related riding mistakes. When you talked about your Bell 500 and your Bell staff jacket and your Honda CB160, it got me wondering, over the years of riding, do you have a story about getting caught in weather that you found particularly poignant, or that you often point to as a sort of a low point or a questionable decision that you made in your life?
Well, Barb and I we had a wonderful trip. We went to the Isle of Man for a week, but we also did a 1-week tour of Ireland after that on a Suzuki 650G. And we both had Bell staff jackets, and we discovered the week we were in Ireland, it was cold and rainy. It just poured almost the whole time we were there. And we discovered that they really are not rainproof after a certain number of days and hours. And so we vowed on the next trip we would probably get something that had a shiny surface on it, something rubbery or plastic. And fabric jackets have improved a lot since then as far as rainproofness. But of course, you could reproof a Bell staff jacket with wax, and ours were probably getting used a little too much, and we hadn't done that. So that was a mistake. But I've been pretty cold a number of times on trips. I wrote one for Cycle World where I got caught in a snowstorm on a spring day, meeting a friend of mine halfway to his house in Wisconsin. And we met at a restaurant, and it started snowing while we were there. and we had to turn around and go home, and it was a little bit grim.
Yeah, well, I think it.
I went to. I did a trip in the Mississippi Delta. I went one of about 3 trips I've done there, but to test the new Triumph Bonneville, the modern 900 Bonneville, and I went down to Nashville to pick up the bike, and I had to ride to Memphis from there, and then around the Mississippi Delta, and then I had to come back to Nashville, and I had a Harley Road King at the time, and the temperature dropped suddenly. It was in the fall, and it got really cold, and so I remember riding that Harley home at night, and I was really under-equipped for it and should have brought more stuff along. And I stopped at a gas station somewhere in central Illinois and walked in at night to get some coffee, convenience store, and the guy behind the counter says, I had my helmet in my hand. He said, "Don't tell me that you're riding a motorcycle tonight." I said, "Only I am." And he said, you better have some coffee. So, I think really getting caught in the cold is probably the hardest thing on a bike. It's when you're not dressed for it.
Well, it's funny because you're talking about Belstaff jackets and using wax, and we're so spoiled in 2024 because we've got Gore-Tex and Thermalite liners and all this other stuff, and it's changed so much over the past years. It's funny, you mentioned the story with Nashville, and actually it was a column that you wrote after that I used to introduce you to our audience before you jumped on, because after that trip, you wrote a column called Another Green Triumph, where you ended up buying 2004 Bonneville T100. And that was the first article that I remember my dad giving me a copy of it and saying, hey, you need to read this article. And I then went out and bought my first bike, which was a 2005 Triumph Bonneville T100. And then I went and found the larger article, and then you had all these. So it was really interesting that you brought that story up, because that was a story that I used to introduce you. And fun fact, years later, I got started working in the motorcycle industry. I had moved to Nashville, and I started working at Castle Power Sports, which is, as I later found out, the dealership where you picked up the Bonneville.
I picked it up.
Yeah.
And
so
I got back to Castle and returned the bike, and then I went to my brother had just moved into a new house, and the furnace didn't work. So and my brother had no blankets, so I slept in my wet, cold motorcycle gear and had a tablecloth over me or something, and then got on the bike the next morning. It was about 42 degrees or something, and took off for Wisconsin. So
you can't count on family. Who can you count on? My God. So
I think it's particularly poignant. I just like to say that when we first brought up the sort of, do you remember, getting caught in weather that was particularly bad? You brought up the ride you were on with your wife. I think anytime any of us have been with a partner, friend, wife, whatever, those are the times I think when we tend to digest the mistake. It
makes a big impression. It's a lasting scar.
Well, it's one thing. It's one thing if we're willing to go through it ourselves. It's another thing to subject our significant other to the madness that we're sometimes okay with.
Yeah. We rode around Ireland, and we'd get up in the morning, and Barb would say, "I'm not going to stay at another place that doesn't have hot water." Ireland. This was a long time ago, and Ireland had not really gone through a revival of its industry and so on, and people were pretty poor for the most part, and so we would go to a bed and breakfast and ring the doorbell and I'd say, "Excuse me, but they would have a room," and I'd say, "We're really cold. Do you have hot water? My wife would love to take a hot shower or a bath." And they said, "Oh, we've got lovely hot water. Oh, you poor thing, come on in." And then we would go up to the room, and Barb would run the faucet and have her hand under it. I'd say, "How is it?" She said, "Ice cold." And I'd go down and say, "We don't seem to be getting any hot water." "Oh, I think I forgot to put a shilling in the meter." And but there we are for the night, so we got colder and colder on that trip. It was cumulative.
Yeah, that's brutal.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, I think you said a lasting star. That's a good way to put it. Those tend to hang around.
So Zach had asked a question earlier and kind of tied in. Sometimes I think we take for granted touring, on smaller bikes versus bigger motorcycles. And obviously, as you go through the process of working up your displacement chain, you get used to some creature comforts. But I think all of us have toured on small bikes at one point in time or another. And we had done an episode about dream trips on dream machines. But I think the question I want to ask here is, you had taken a trip at one point in time on a little 1964 Honda C100, which is like a 50cc scooter. Your riding partner was on a bicycle, and
Right.
you got to the end of the trip and you said, "This is, I think, the best trip that I have ever taken on a motorcycle." It was your favorite trip at the time, was how you ended the story. So 40 years later, is that still the best trip you ever took? Or do you have a dream trip that you took on a motorcycle that is your quintessential top pick?
Well, that trip was a lot of fun, just because we had to limit the speed, and we took, of course, very back roads to do it, because we didn't really want to be in heavy traffic anywhere on the trip. So we're taking really remote country roads on the trip. That was a lot of fun. I had a trip in mind, a dream trip that I was planning on about 3 years ago, and I wanted to go to Alaska. And I was trying to decide whether I should ride to Alaska from here, or fly into Fairbanks, or one of the major cities, and rent a bike. And I decided I'd really like to take time off and ride across Canada. And I just happened to be going to the Quail motorcycle gathering, and I had the good luck to sit at a table with Malcolm Smith. And I told him that I was thinking about going to Alaska, and I said, "What? You've got his dealership handles several brands of motorcycle." And I said, "What would you take if you were going from Wisconsin to Alaska?" And I'd like to do some back roads and some exploring, and get off-road a bit. And he said, "I wouldn't take anything larger than a 350. And I said, "Really? A 350 from Wisconsin to California?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, they'll go fast enough on the highway, and it might not be as good on the highway as something that is a 1,000cc bike or something bigger. But he said, the important thing is, when you get there, you want to survive. You want to have fun on the back roads and come out without dropping the bike and having nobody to help you pick it up. And he said, he pointed out that he had spent his whole career without really riding or racing any bike that weighed more than about 250 pounds. And he said, I would get a 250 or a 350. And he said, "I know people ride larger bikes than that off-road." But he said, I don't know why anybody would go off-road on a bike that weighs more than 250 pounds. He said, "What are they thinking? Why would you do that to yourself?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting point of view coming from Malcolm Smith. But obviously, when you're crossing Saskatchewan or something, it's nice to have a relaxed motorcycle that isn't beating you to death or running at red line. So
and for those of you listening that might not be familiar, Malcolm Smith is a world-renowned desert racer. He was especially fundamental in the whole Baja 1000 and the Southern California desert scene. There's an excellent biography on him. It's a large hard print covered book that has photos and all kinds of stories about him. So if you're not familiar with Malcolm Smith and who Peter's talking about, there's a great book out there you can kind of read to familiarize yourself.
that is a good book. And another way to learn about Malcolm Smith is to watch On Any Sunday, because he's one of the stars of, as it were, of that movie. And there's some film of him crossing Baja, and I've never seen anybody who looks like as much of a natural rider off-road as the films I've seen of Malcolm Smith. He just looks like he was born to do it, and doesn't seem to make any mistakes, and just flying across country wide open, and doesn't do what I do, which is suddenly hit a big rock or disappear into a ravine. And
or if he does hit a big rock, it doesn't knock him off the bike, which is our mere mortal reaction, right?
jumps over it instead of ending up in the hospital. Yeah, he's an amazing, a very nice person too. It was really fun to sit with him at a table and talk with him. He's a wonderful guy. And he's still very involved in charities in Baja. He helps with medical and schools and so on. He goes down there quite a bit with his wife, who is a pilot. And Malcolm is an aircraft mechanic, certified aircraft mechanic as well. So they're a good pair, and they go down there a lot still.
I always thought
this is a good.
Go ahead, Zach.
This is a good call out. I was going to say, if you're a high side, low side listener and you call yourself a fan and you have not seen On Any Sunday, that's required reading, required watching, I should say. You should. That's a requisite for being a high side, low side listener fan, a true fan anyway. That's what I have to say, and a good reminder. So thanks for that, Peter.
Great, yeah, it's a great film.
I was going to say, wrapping up with Malcolm Smith, one of the things that I really liked that he talked about in his book was he got started learning how to work on things because the British and American garages at the time wouldn't work on Honda motorcycles when they came into the country, and he would basically be the person that they turned to as a kid, where he'd go into the shops and put together like Honda Cubs, and that's how he made his money to get into motorcycling, and it was just a fascinating story. But pivoting, you brought up On Any Sunday, one of the questions that Zach and I had talked about was around favorite motorcycle movies. Is On Any Sunday up there for you, or do you have a favorite quintessential pick for it's a rainy winter afternoon? What's your recommendation for someone for a motorcycle movie that they might not have seen?
Yeah, I think On Any Sunday is probably the most complete movie about motorcycling in that era. It's a great beginning place, and I have a copy of it. Actually, I've got about 3 copies of it in different media, and but I have to watch it about once a year just to remind myself how much fun that era was for people getting into dirt bikes and so on. And that would be one of my favorite movies. I think trying to think, another movie I need to watch every so often is V for Victory, it's called, and it's a film of Joey Dunlop at the Isle of Man doing a 110-mile-an-hour lap with a camera on the bike, and it's harrowing to watch. Barb and I have been to the Isle of Man. We spent a week there, and they open the track between sessions, and you can ride around the track. And I thought, what a place to learn. It's really 37 miles of complex corners and changes of pavement, and to be able to do that consistently, as Joey Dunlop was able to do, and other people, Mike Halewood, but. I can always sit back and watch that. There are a number of good films from the bike perspective on the Isle of Man, but that's probably one of my favorites. And Joey is very too. He was actually one of my favorite moments in that film is the bike is speeding around, and there's an announcer who's working with him, a host, and the host says, "Joey, this is a very difficult and complex track. Do you have to remember every single breaking point? And you must pick out things that you could see a house or a white house along there or something as a breaking point. And you must know exactly where to enter the corner. And how do you keep it all in mind?" And there was a long silence, and Joey Dunlop said, "Well, not really." He said, there's bits I like and there's bits I don't like. And when I get to a bit I don't like, I slow down." And I thought, that's pretty good, because you hear about people who absolutely memorize the place, and he just seems to have adapted to it naturally or something. And what did he win there, 3 times? But,
just sort of like soaked it in through osmosis or something. It's like in his blood. I remember that movie also. My dad bought it when I was a kid, and we watched it. And I remember just it's just a wild development of the machine that he was riding, which was that V4, and it was just seems like such a fast and unruly bike to ride around the Isle of Man, which is already incredibly dangerous. And then of course capturing all the video in that time, like this is obviously well before GoPros and whatnot. A lot of that footage was sort of so groundbreaking and interesting because they weren't really putting cameras on bikes in the way that we've become so accustomed to in the modern age. So those are good call outs. Those are both ring in my youth, the On Any Sunday and V for Victory.
That's
Those,
one
I
of
like those picks.
that's one of the things to remember too when you talk about On Any Sunday, like the shot where they have like the reel-to-reel camera like taped to the helmet, and it's like it's unbelievable when you think about how that movie was actually made. Like we're spoiled.
Yeah.
It's like looking at camera crews for the movie Grand Prix or something. There's somebody sitting at the back of a Ferrari or a very fast car with a whole camera rig. He's about 3 inches off the ground. And you think, boy, there's a dangerous job photographing Formula One cars. But,
yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
So another question we had about eras was something we covered on the podcast at some point. And I guess you talk about you sort of referenced On Any Sunday just now, and you said something like it's interesting to reflect on how impactful dirt bikes were in that era and how many people were getting on motorcycles and that kind of thing. Do you have an era in mind that sort of, I don't know, if you could sort of get in the time machine and go back and experience an era of motorcycling history in real time? Do you have a time that you sort of always long to see in person?
I think from the perspective of a lot of people being involved, it's hard to beat the late 60s and through the 70s. People are tired of hearing about the boomers, but in fact, my generation, when I was in high school, almost everybody wanted to ride a motorcycle or at least tried it. People who were even not very mechanical or inclined to do that sort of thing would at least try to ride a motorcycle and see if they liked it. And it was a social thing, and it was cool. Steve McQueen was in the movies and was a known desert racer, and was in Great Escape and so on. So it's like the whole generation decided that motorcycles were a pretty good thing, almost like rock and roll or the Rolling Stones or something. So there were a lot of people in the 70s who bought motorcycles who were my age, who suddenly had a real job and had enough money to buy a bike. And there's a huge increase in the number of people who are riding dirt bikes. And so that was a very active era. And you had a nice spillover from the 60s. You still had a lot of the traditional brands available. British bikes were still doing a good business, and the new Japanese stuff was coming in. And BMW was updating with the R90S and so on. So there's a nice overlap of classic bikes and brand new Japanese technology and so on that was really leading the way. And when I started at Cycle World, it was 1980, and right after I started there, motorcycle sales started to drop, and I hate to take the blame for that.
I would say, is there a correlation there?
No, I had nothing to do with it. But I think a lot of people also my age had got married. Now they had kids on the way or something and decided maybe they really couldn't afford a new bike or something. And so sales dropped quite a bit. And the Japanese, I took advantage of buying a couple of bikes in the early 70s where they had overproduced Japanese bikes and had them on sale. Actually, my wife bought me a KZ1000 Mark II for my birthday, but it was at a time when I was planning to buy the bike anyway, and she surprised me with it, but it was pretty heavily discounted.
It sounds like she surprised you with a couple of bikes over the years. She sounds like a keeper.
She did. She bought me the KZ1000. She also bought me a CB350. Honda. Right after we got married, I'd gotten out of the Army and I was gone back to school. And while I was in Vietnam, my parents had sold my CB160. I told them to just sell it. I was going to buy a much bigger bike when I got out. I was going to buy a new Triumph or Norton. And but of course I didn't. I decided to go bum around Europe for 6 months instead. And so I did that. And then I was out of money and went back to school. But I missed having a motorcycle, and I was reading the magazines all the time. And all of a sudden, for my birthday one day, I I came downstairs to get the paper, and I said, "There's funny, somebody's parked a red pickup truck in front of our house, our apartment building." And Barb said, "Oh, I borrowed that from a doctor at work." Barb was working already as a physical therapist at the hospital. And she said, "We need that truck to pick up your birthday present." And I thought, well, what could she possibly have bought me that needs a pickup truck? I know what it is. It's a big Sears toolbox, because I've got this small toolbox, and it's I need a better one. But we went right past the Sears store and kept going out of town, and all of a sudden it hit me. She was going to Prairie du Chien to Stark's Honda, which was slightly discounted from the Madison area Honda dealerships. And so we got down there on this very cold, snowy day, and walked in, and there's a green CB350 with a tag on it that says Egan sold. And so that was my return to motorcycling, thanks to Barb.
Terrific.
I love it.
Terrific memory and story. That's awesome. Well, I hate to interrupt the flow we have going here, because we're really enjoying talking to you, Peter. But we do customarily in the podcast take a quick break in the middle,
Sure.
just for an intermission for us and to get a word from our sponsor. So we'll do that now, and we'll be right back.
All right. So coming back, we wanted to kind of talk about do's and don'ts and dates gone awry. The conversation that originally started with two up tails, and what we kind of did was we kind of pivoted this a little bit from the norm, where we talked about, times that we had two up passengers, but we actually have a question for you. Zach's a new parent. I am a soon-to-be parent, and your first experience that I remember reading about on a motorcycle trip was you were a kid and you were hitchhiking, and a guy on a Harley stopped to give you a ride. You hopped on the back of this stranger's motorcycle, and you were the two-up passenger for the first time, and your parents are somewhere else, not to be seen. So my question for you is, how old were you? Because you didn't disclose that in the story. And then two, could you imagine doing that as a kid today? Or have we gotten too careful as a society? Has society gotten too dangerous? Like, unpack your experience for us and for the audience, and then let us know if we should let our kids hop on the back of a Harley with a stranger in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was probably about 13 or 14 when I did that trip, and I was trying to get to a junkyard. There was a junkyard about halfway between my hometown of Awry and Lisbon, and I used to go there and wander around all afternoon and look at cars and think about what stock car I could build or what I could modify. And so I was trying to hitchhike to the junkyard, and these two guys went by on big Harleys, big two-tone windshields and FLHs of the era. And one of them just pulled over and said, "Jump on, kid," like that. And the other guy says, "What are you doing? You should give him a ride." And he's, "Nah, he needs a ride." So I jumped on the back, and I couldn't believe how much fun it was. And I looked over his shoulder, and I seem to recall that the speedometer was hovering in the 80-mile-an-hour range. I thought, this is the best thing I've ever done. And so I just rode with them all the way into Lisbon. They were going to a shop called Pettis Harley Davidson. And I ended up spending the afternoon there wandering around looking at bikes. And I said, I've got to have a motorcycle. And, but I wouldn't have told my parents that I did. When you get to be 14 or 15, you don't lie, but you don't tell the whole truth either. You just, "Oh yeah, I hitchhiked. It was fine. Had a good time." And, I didn't. My dad was a little leery. My parents were both leery of motorcycles. They didn't really want me to have one. And when I showed an interest, my mother said at the breakfast table, "As I live and breathe, you will never own a motorcycle." And my dad agreed. And I just sat there and thought, well, they're just wrong. Of course I'm going to own a motorcycle. They must be joking. And I can't think about anything else. Anyway, they eventually allowed me to buy this Bridgestone 50 because I convinced them it was a scooter, which was almost a bicycle. So when I survived a year of that without crashing, they were okay. But I think, I was in a small town. I think cities are a different place for kids to get out and wander around loose all day. But when I was growing up, parents let you out in the morning if you didn't have some task you had to do, just to go play with your friends. And so, they'd say, be back for lunch or be back for dinner or something, be back at 6. And you could do anything. We could go shooting BB guns in the woods and fishing in a creek. I mean, I hate to make it sound like a Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer type thing, but that's really what it was. And a couple of friends of mine and I used to hop freight trains and ride into Lisbon and back. And my hometown was a big rail center, a small rail center, but they had a lot of freight trains coupling and changing and moving to different tracks. And we would just jump on a freight car and jump out of the car when it got to New Lisbon, because they usually weren't going very fast through town, tumble down, an embankment somewhere, and then walk to the junkyard. But I think parents were a lot more. They let kids just go out and wander, and kids will be kids, and they'll do whatever they're going to do. And so we're always climbing trees, and I don't know. Just I think it was a wilder time for children. My friends of mine who have kids now seem to spend a lot of time taking them to very organized things. And my parents had just a passing interest in whether they saw my Little League game or not. In fact, it was always a little embarrassing if your parents paid too much attention. If you had some, father and mother who came to every game and were cheering, it was like embarrassing, because it's just you and the guys, or you and your class. And
right.
So was a different era, I think, for that.
I'm learning so much. I'm never going to my kids' sporting events. If God forbid they play sports. Secondly, we just have to have our kids lie to us. So, or at least lie to mom. Never tell her anything that you're doing. So
yeah. Well, my dad helped a little bit, because he confessed that when he was in high school, they used to jump trains, and I took that as an okay. That as long as I didn't tell anybody about it, it was okay to jump a train. So
yeah, well, I definitely think, it's pretty clear. I don't think anyone would really deny that that children probably used to be a lot more feral than they are now. And of course, you point out that the population density has something to do with it too. I think that's a pretty fair note to make there.
Small town. I mean, they recognize immediately whose child you are and where you're going, and they wonder what you're doing, and so you are watched. So I think that makes a difference too.
Yeah. I think you hit a key point, because Zach grew up in a small town. I grew up in a small town. We both live in cities now, but I think my parents just didn't want to. They didn't want to. My mom loved us, but she didn't want us in the house. It was go outside and play, because she had stuff to do, and she wanted us out of her hair. So
I think that's a pretty. Yeah, I think that's a. I don't know. There's maybe that's a, I don't know, like almost a rite of passage, or it's like a place where it feels like a place where any good parent gets, where they suggest that the child parents themselves to a certain extent. But I think that's a pretty fun anecdote, and yeah, what a way to sort of have your first motorcycling experience like that. And I guess a quick follow-up question I have is, what did you sort of, you said you remember sitting on the back of that Harley as the guy went along at 80 miles an hour, and you thought, this is just the best, but you're not known as a speed freak or anything like that, or a track rider particularly, or that type of thing. You even joked with us as you joined our call here today that if we ever went on a ride with you, we'd find it very underwhelming. So what is do you have a story about the fastest you've ever gone on a motorcycle, or is that ever, like, when did that kind of recede into the back of your mind as a goal of motorcycling?
Well, I've liked fast bikes for a long time, but I raced motorcycles in the late 70s and early 80s. So I was in Awry in the Midwest, and then in California I was in AFM, I guess, and And so I raced at Riverside and Ontario and Laguna Seca and places like that. But I liked racing and performance bikes. And I think the fastest I've gone on a bike was 150. I had I had a ZX11 Kawasaki for a while and hit an open stretch of 4-lane road with no cars coming or going and just open it up. And I've got to see what it feels like to go 150. And but I don't usually ride 150 anymore. It's gets pretty busy. But yeah, I like speed. I've raced cars for a long time, Formula cars and so on. But
right.
As I get older and my friends get older, we're happy to have gotten through what we got through and aren't anxious to spend the summer with a cast on one leg or anything. Summers get more valuable as you get older, and you want to spend it sitting in a lazy boy looking at a cast. So I've had a couple of dirt bike accidents in the last 6 years that were one, I broke 3 ribs and spent the whole summer in a lazy boy, and they're really well smashed. And then I just got real banged up a couple of years ago, and I thought, I don't really need to do this to myself anymore. And I probably should stop riding too fast on single track trips and so on.
So I've learned that even at a younger age. I have a knee that doesn't like it when I keep crashing on it all the time. So
would you care to tell Peter Egan which motorcycle gnarled your knee and created this life you live now?
It was a Royal Enfield Himalayan. It bested me with its power. Yep, I was at the press launch for that bike down in Texas, and I got cocky, and we were doing a video shoot, and I had taken my gear off in between, and the producer was like, "Well, just go pull the bike around," and I was like, "It's a Royal Enfield Himalayan. I'm gonna be fine." And I hopped on in I think I might have even been in shorts and a t-shirt, and I went to go around and I hit some loose gravel and tweaked the front end and went down, and my knee has never been the same. And the video was never produced. And to this day, I rue the day that I met the Royal Enfield Himalayan.
Well, you see, you've got to take those bikes seriously. You were
That's right. I'm so glad you brought that up, Peter. He did admit being cocky, and that's fair. But yeah, if you have something like whatever it is, 28 horsepower, you really do need to learn to respect it, Spurgeon.
Well, Zach, hang on, Zach. So Peter kind of gave us the story about hopping in the back of a Harley. Let me ask you a question. As the father right now with young Wilder, if he came back at 12 or 13 and was like, "Dad, I just hitchhiked here on the back of a Road King. Aren't you proud of me?" Would you either be A, excited and proud, or would you be B, incredibly furious?
I think I'd be a little nervous. I don't know if I'd be furious. It's hard to get furious with somebody for doing something you would love to have done, but at that time.
I feel like if my son got on the back of a motorcycle with someone else and said they had a great time, I would be a little bit offended. But I think that ultimately the question, a more analogous question might be like if he came back and said, I met this guy who was fly fishing and he said, "Hey, you want to come give it a try?" And I don't know anything about fly fishing. I've never done that. I don't. That's not something I know. And then he was sort of like, "Oh, he let me try," or playing the violin or something. He was like, "Oh, he let me try it," and it was cool and I liked it. I feel like I would. I know where you're going with this, Spurgeon. Yeah, I think it's tuned into our millennial brains that if anyone gives more than a sidelong glance at your child, then they're immediately suspect number one for some sort of societal perversion. But I don't think that we should necessarily rule out other people, offering sort of skills, advice, experience to our children. But maybe I'll sing in a different tune if it actually comes to be that way. I don't know.
Yeah. It would bother me knowing what a kid was riding with somebody he didn't know. I would feel a lot better if I knew the person who had the motorcycle, because it's people. I did a lot of hitchhiking and also to junkyards in the area, and very often the people who would stop were farmers who were on their way into town or home from a bar in town, and they would open the door and 3 or 4 beer cans would roll out. And you'd stand there for a minute and think, I wonder if this is a good choice for a ride, but I'd usually get in.
I love the idea of some parent listening to High Side Low Side right now with their kid, and their kid some 15-year-old thinking like, oh, hitchhiking with the beer cans rolling out the door, and the parents like, no, geez, crows them, don't do that. Yeah, I don't know, like you said, maybe it's just a different time. I'm not sure. I I appreciate that. Well, Spurge, I think maybe we could pivot to a question of how many bikes. Does that sound like a right thing to do here?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the questions we had, we've chewed over on this podcast, Peter, is the idea of how many bikes in the garage is too many. And of course, this is incredibly subjective, and it just depends what you're into, what you like, how big your garage is. But you have been known to ask the question of, if you have 5 bikes in your garage, what are they going to be? And I guess we're curious to ask this question on the podcast right now. So what's your answer right now? Like, is there such a thing as Go ahead, Spurge.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, fun fact before you answer was that's how I met Zach. Was we were at a launch together, and I played the game with Zach. I was like, hey, how many? If you could only have 5 motorcycles in your garage, what 5 would they be? So I stole your game to befriend Zach before we were working together.
You didn't need the one more answer. How many bikes did you need? One more. It's just like guitars. But, yeah, I've only got 2 bikes right now, but. I'm looking at a Ducati project, that 900SS project that I might do. A friend of mine's got one that he found that has been sitting for 20 years. And so I think if I had more garage space and more money, I would be dangerous as far as collecting bikes. It would be very easy they're just wonderful to have around and look at. And but I think I wrote a column years ago that, to me, 5 bikes was about as many as I could handle and still maintain and use. And they represented different parts of the motorcycle world. It was nice to have kind of a cruiser. I think at the time I had a Harley Road King or something, just to go out on an evening and ride around and enjoy the weather. And it's nice to have a race. I was doing track days. I had a Ducati 996 and did a lot of track days with that. And it's fun to have a vintage bike of some kind. Of course, I'm a big British bike nut, so a Triumph and a Norton are always nice to have in the garage, or a BSA. And I was riding dirt bikes too at the time, so it's nice. I always, until recently, I always had I guess the Royal Enfield is a dirt bike, but I'm not doing any single track riding anymore. But it's nice to have. You're doing a lot of different things. It's nice to have that covered.
So I guess using the lens of what you talked about earlier, which was, your perspective has changed. You like smaller displacement bikes that are not quite as heavy. If you had to look at those 5 bikes, money's no object. You're not living on a fixed income. We're giving you unlimited funds. Same categories. Like if you were going to put a cruiser, a dirt bike, a sport bike, a vintage bike in your garage right now, do you have any off the top of your head picks of that's the bike that I would go with for each category?
I think for a sport bike it would be a Ducati, because I've been a Ducati buff for a long time, and I've had a lot of them and done track days, and that's one reason I may be interested in restoring this 900SS.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I need another dirt bike right now. It's the field goes about as far off road as I want to go for the moment. But I thought about getting I've had about 3 Road Kings over the years, and I thought about getting another one. And I sat on one the other day in a shop and just picked it up off the side stand, and it was about all I could do to lever get it upright. And I said, I don't think I need this anymore. I could easily drop this in the garage, moving it around, backing it up or something. So I think I'll just remember the ones I had and stay away from it. But
yeah, that's fair. I'm reminded of maybe one of your more recent columns that my father actually cited and actually continues to cite, something about your motorcycle ownership and wanting your fingers to smell like gasoline a little bit less often or something like that. And I noticed that you have like the Himalayan, which you said has been sort of low maintenance. But I noticed that you're talking about getting another, getting a Ducati or getting a sport bike and having it be some sort of project, a bike that's been sitting, and I assume that means taking it apart and tinkering with it and rebuilding it to some extent. So do you think that where does your mind sit right now in the sort of on the spectrum of wanting to have bikes that you can just turn a key and ride, whereas or having something to work on?
I think I'm liking bikes a lot more that I don't have to work on. I've got 2 bikes that are fuel injected right now, and I don't miss carburetors very much. I mean, if I were restoring a Triumph, I'd work on the amyls and rebuild them. But for daily use, I don't miss carburation. Every bike I've had with fuel injection just runs flawlessly and starts immediately. And I don't know how to fix fuel injection, but I've never had any fail either. So so far so good. So I like bikes. Like I've got my other bike right now is a Triumph T120 at 1200. It's the first year of a 16, I guess it is. And I love that bike, and it's trouble free. I don't really need to wonder what that funny noise is when I'm going 80 miles an hour. Is it oiling? Do I have a rod problem? It just runs, and I like that. I like just going someplace knowing I'm going to turn around and come home and not have to stop by the side of the road and figure out what's wrong.
Well, it's funny. So my dad's one question, because Zach and I both reached out to our dads who introduced us to your writing and your work. And, it was funny because I said to my dad, I said, if you had to have a question for Peter, what would you want it to be? And my dad is somebody that has loved riding motorcycles, but does not like working on motorcycles. And so the joke in my house has always been like, oh, well, where did you, pick up your mechanical skills and whatnot? And everybody always assumes it's your father. And in my case, it wasn't my father. He's the one that would call me panicked and be like, I just put power steering fluid in the brake reservoir. Is that going to be a problem? Should I not drive my truck? I'm like, pull the car over, Dad. But his question for you was, if somebody offered you, right now today, a vintage Ducati or a vintage Triumph, you could pick whatever vintage Ducati or Triumph you wanted, or a modern day Triumph or a modern day Ducati. It was the only bike you could ride. Would you choose modern, or would you choose vintage for where you're at?
I'd probably choose modern right now. I mean, that's what I've got right now. So that's apparently what I've decided without thinking about it. I a vintage bike as well. It's fun to, it'd be fun to have another Triumph 650 TR6C or something like the one I restored years ago.
So another topic we covered quite recently actually was sort of the idea of how classic are modern classic bikes. There are a lot of motorcycles in this day and age that reach for the aesthetic or feel of bikes that are actually old. And anyone who spent time on old bikes will tell you that there's quite a difference between riding say a vintage Triumph or an original Ducati Scrambler from the 70s and a new Ducati Scrambler. They're reaching for the look there, but the experience is quite different. So how do you what's your take on that? Kind of, you ride around on your new T120 Bonneville, and there's a certain amount of joy that you get from not having to work on it, not having to worry if it'll start, and not having to worry about whether oil is getting to the appropriate parts of the engine, as you said. But is there's something that's taken away, right? There's something missing, would you say?
Oh yeah. There's some sort of involvement missing, I would say. Also, it's a lot of the older classics are lighter and simpler, and you can work on them yourself. One time, people occasionally ask me if I could have one sports car, what would I buy? And I said, probably an MGB. And that surprises them. And why an MGB? I said, because I can do absolutely everything myself. I can rebuild the end. I've rebuilt several of those engines. I can rebuild the transmission. I don't have to take it, unless I have it painted by a skilled painter, I don't have to take it anywhere. There's nothing that can go wrong with it that I can't fix. And I think that's probably the difference. If I have my older Triumphs from the 60s, I could really do about anything on them if I had time, take the engine apart, take it out. And I don't picture a future where a lot of people are going to be pulling current bikes out of a junkyard and trying to figure out how to fix the fuel injection system, and why the information system isn't really working right, and why the speedometer doesn't function. used to be a broken cable or a broken Smith's speedometer, and now it could be anything. So I think part of the appeal of a classic bike is that fixability that, especially in England, people are just expected to maintain their own bikes and change the oil and adjust things. And now you don't have to, but we don't know how to do a lot of those things unless we have the right computer hookup and so on. So I think that's still the appeal of classic bikes, is the starkness and simplicity of them.
Yeah, I think it's also, I think from an appeal standpoint, and then one of the other things that we often talk about is the fact that, like, unfortunately at times people like the appeal until they get into it and they get in over their heads, and then all of a sudden the appeal wears off pretty quickly when they can't figure out how to get it running, or they bought a basket case and now they're not riding their motorcycle, they're trying to figure out how to work on a motorcycle. So one of the things that we always kind of talked and joked about was you should always have a running bike first, and then if you want to learn how to work on one, like maybe that's your second bike that sits over here in the corner, so you can still enjoy riding one.
Right.
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, I would say good choice.
Take it from Peter Egan. That's what he's doing. He's got his modern Bonneville that he rides around on, his Himalayan, you're reaching, might get that 900 SS Ducati just to scratch the itch, right? Just to have something to.
Well, I've always had a project in the garage usually for the winter. I've restored a lot of cars and motorcycles, and my friend Richie Mayer in California calls himself the patron saint of lost causes, because he's always spotting an old car somewhere that it's forgotten and neglected behind a garage, and he has to tow it home and see if he can put it back on the road. And I have a little of that instinct myself. That the first Bonneville I bought was leaning against a barn and out in the country, and I just saw it in the winter with the handlebars sticking out of the snow, and had to go back in the spring and see if it was still there. And I bought that and got it running. And that was my first triumph. But it's fun
dynamite.
to and bring them back to life.
Yeah, agreed.
So speaking of bringing bikes back to life, I think a lot of times, we talk about the bikes that we regret selling, right? Like, even as you were kind of telling some stories, there's bikes that maybe, got away or you look back on fondly, whether it's a vintage Triumph or a vintage Ducati. Do you have any bikes that you regret buying? Is there a bike that you're like, that I shouldn't have done that? That was not what I should have done with my time.
Not really. I've had fun with everything I've bought. Even if you learn a lesson from it, it's fun to have had it and find out what it's about. And I don't know. I bought an RD 400 that somebody was selling on my block when we lived in California in the 80s, and fifth gear was out on the bike, and I started playing around with it. And at one point, I don't really want to take this transmission and engine apart to see why fifth gear doesn't work. I think I'll just sell it to somebody who's more ambitious than I am, which I did. Another guy wanted to buy it. It was inexpensive, but yeah, there's a limit to how deeply you want to delve into a project.
And do you have off the top of your head, do you know how many motorcycles you've owned in your lifetime?
Well, I sat down about 5 years ago or 6 years ago with my friend Mike Moseman, who's a worse addict than I am, and we decided to sit around and make a list. We each took a big tablet and just decided to see if we could remember the sequence and how many bikes we've owned. And at the end of the evening, Mike said, "I think I've got it. I haven't forgotten any." And I said, I have too. And it was we both hit 76. And I think I've probably owned 10 bikes since then. So it's probably in the 80s somewhere. But a lot of people who read Cycle World are one market buffs. They wouldn't have anything but a BMW or anything but a Honda or whatever. And they always, when I talk to people, sometimes they say, "How could you own one of these and sell it?" I said, "Well, I wanted to try something else. Life is short, and it's fun to try something else when you've been riding I usually keep bikes for about 3 years, and although those spans are getting longer now because I like the bikes I've got, but it was fun to try something you haven't tried before and see what it's about rather than just stick with one one type of motorcycle.
I like it. Yeah, yeah. Spurge, I know you had a couple of questions to round out the our time with Peter here.
I feel like we're gonna have a hard time topping that answer as like a rounding off. And so like there's all kind. I mean, like I think that was kind of like the one fundamental question, and I think we could keep going. And I want to keep going, but I also want to be respectful of Peter's time. I want to be respectful of the audience's time. So like I think at this point we get to play the engine sound guessing game with Peter Egan, and we get to see if he can beat us. And I'm excited for that.
Well, we'll see.
All right, so for those of you listening, this is the engine sound guessing game for high side, low side. We are going to play an engine sound. It's a 30-second clip. We are going to make some guesses. There's 3 hints. Do we have the hints, Producer Chase? Producer Chase is waving his finger that we will have the hints. Peter is going to listen to the sound and play along with us, and you can play at home. So scream out your answers to the stereo speakers that you're listening to the show through. And Zach, did I miss anything, or without any further ado, we play the sound?
I don't think so. No, we'll just give a quick pause here in airtime to let you, the audience member, listen along with us, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, we always do guest honors. So Peter, I'd like to know what you have to say. I feel very confident. This is the sound of my youth.
How many cylinders? Peter.
I would say it's a twin. It sounds like a V-twin to me, just the sequence of how it's firing. But I could be wrong, 180-degree twin or something. But it sounded to me like a V-twin. And my first thought was there's enough mechanical noise and spacing and the way the cylinders are firing. I thought it might be something pretty rare, unusual, like a Vincent Black Shadow or something. But then when it revs up, it smooths out a little bit, and it sounds a little more hollow, and I hate to say tinny, but there's a little more, it doesn't sound like a vintage muffler on the bike. So I think it's something quite a bit newer than that.
Okay, so vintage, okay. So just for the audience, Vincent's Shadow is a British motorcycle that would have been manufactured in like the 40s and 50s, and you've actually owned one, correct?
Yeah, I did. I had a 51.
Okay.
And that's a 55-degree V-twin or 50 something, is that right? Do you remember, Peter?
Remember to call Kevin and find out. I might.
No worries. Well, I think that my take here is that you are right in your 180-degree twin. I think this is a BMW Airhead, and I think that you're onto something with the smoothing out. When you hear it rev up and you hear it kind of smooth. And I think that's an affect of that, it's kind of boxer twin, which is fairly smooth at higher RPM. And I think this is like an older. Well, I don't know about guessing total displacement or anything, but I think anything like R60, R75. I think it's a 2-valve Airhead from the 60s or 70s or something. That's what I'm hearing.
I was hearing twin. I obviously am not as I've never owned a Vincent, so I wasn't thinking Vincent. And I, despite the fact that I have a BMW motorcycle on my T-shirt right now, I've never owned a vintage BMW the way that Zach's family has. But I was thinking vintage twin. My guess was actually going more like Moto Guzzi, is where my head kind of went towards. But
the Guzzi is a sort of a, in some ways. Because it's a little longitudinal crank, it sort of feels like it's related to a BMW in my mind anyway, even though it's a V-twin instead of a flat twin. But yeah, any other insight, Peter, on your end, or should we give ourselves a hint?
I could imagine either one of those. I've had a couple of older BMW Boxer twins, and that hadn't occurred to me, but I could, that firing pattern sounded about right. But I don't know. And I had a Moto Guzzi as well, and it's a similar sound and cadence to it. But I don't think it's a Ducati because there wasn't enough clutch rattle.
Yeah,
So,
you can't hear that dry clutch, which sounds like it sounds like it's falling out of the bike.
Yeah, I think I feel like I grew up around a lot of airhead BMWs, and I feel like this is and even the starter motor's got that, which makes me think it's a later like R75 or R80 or something like that because of the starter motor instead of being an earlier bike, which is more likely to be kickstart. Anyway, Spurge, talk us through the hint.
The hint isn't going to help us at all, gentlemen, because the first hint is it is a twin-cylinder motorcycle. So we're on the right track.
That. We're way too smart for that. We knew that already.
So here's the second hint. We're just going to go right to it because we know it's a twin. We've narrowed that down. The final hint is that the motorcycle was first launched in 1973. So this motorcycle would have come out in 1973.
That's got to be an R75/5. Does that sound right, Peter? Would that be the first /5, 73?
For the year. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's
my guess.
I have an R. For those of you that want to know what an R75 is, I actually have an R75/5 on my T-shirt.
So you do
today. So I wore a vintage BMW T-shirt in honor of the fact that I was talking to a vintage motorcycle enthusiast today, and I will say the final answer. You were both so close. It was a 1975 BMW R60/6.
Whoa.
Next generation. You see, if we could have speedometer, the old-fashioned speedometer in the headlight, we would have known it was a /5, but we did.
Yeah, if the dog wouldn't have stopped the shit in the woods, it would have caught the rabbit, Peter. But this is the engine sound guessing game, not the speedometer guessing game.
True. Well, I think that we can't blame ourselves. We can't beat ourselves up, Peter or Spurgeon, anybody here, for not telling the difference between an R60/6 and an R75/5. I won't. Although my own father will probably be disappointed that I didn't know the birth year of a R75. But he doesn't listen to this podcast, so luckily he won't know.
I hope I don't get kicked out of the BMW Owners Club. So. Well, actually, the R75/6 is one of the bikes I would like to still own, which I haven't owned. I've ridden them a few times when friends have them, and I think, boy, this is really a nice all-around motorcycle. I could live quite nicely with this. So
I was going to say, like, I want to give a shout out to Martin. Martin, thank you for sending in the engine sound that we played today. Remember, if you want to play the game with us, all you have to do is record a sound of your engine starting up, let it idle, give it a few good revs, make the clip about 30 seconds long, and you might get an opportunity to have your motorcycle on the engine sound guessing game. But in closing, Peter, I guess that's a great final question, and it's one that I kind of skipped over earlier. But are there any motorcycles at this point in time? I mean, you mentioned the R75/6, but is there anything else that comes to mind that you haven't owned that is still on your list to hunt down and put in your garage one day?
Not really. I think I've indulged myself and stretched my finances and so on to try to get most of the bikes I was interested in. And I was lucky to get a Vincent when they were still cheap enough that I could even think about it. And that was a long time ago. So,
well, I mean, what a feeling.
I don't have anything else that's out there. I'd probably go back in time rather than forward at this point if I were to get one or two more bikes.
They'd be ones that you've already owned?
Yeah, I could easily do that. I've had 3 Ducati 900 SS's bevel drive, or one bevel drive, 2 actually, I'm sorry, and 3 of the belt drive 90s bikes. And I like them both. They're both wonderful machines. I could have either one of those. And
when you've had so many BMW 900 SS's in your lifetime that you're forgetting, Ducati 900 SS's that you're forgetting, you don't need to apologize to us. You can go ahead and mistakenly make those numbers, and we'll forgive you.
Yeah. Yeah, I found one
Yeah.
that was salmon colored, and I had to have it repainted. So,
Well, that's a really an excellent way for this to come to an end. I think, Peter, is you saying that you can't think of other bikes that you feel the need to own, because that is the sign of a motorcycling life well lived up to this point. I think if you sort of are looking back on the 80 something bikes you've owned and you think you're satisfied with what you had in the garage, that's got to be a good feeling.
well, they're all fun. That's the thing. It's I've never regretted having any of them. They've all been interesting or fun in their own way. So you can't go wrong.
Well, speaking of
Dynamite.
interesting and fun, this has honestly been an extreme pleasure for me. I know Zach feels the same way, and I just want to take a second and say thank you, not just for taking the time to be here with us today, but thank you for all the work that you've done and for all the people that you've inspired, and you know, the legacy that you really have left on the mark of motorcycling, I think, is something that has affected so many of us, and I appreciate everything that you've done.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on it. It's always a fun show. So I'm enjoying what you guys are doing a lot. So keep it up.
Well, thank you. And like I said, I think we've just scratched the surface. You know, hopefully I'm going to steal your personal phone number from our producer Chase, and I'm going to start. You know, we'll start off with like monthly phone calls where I just ask you questions, and then maybe we'll go up from there.
Yeah, I've got to hear more about the guitars. See what,
Right. Eventually,
you have the right number.
eventually he'll give you all your guitars back that he stole, Peter, and that's when the relationship will come full circle, and you can truly.
Yeah.
Right on. All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, from both of us very much. And for the rest of you, you can stick around with High Side, Low Side for the next few minutes to hear what Spurg and I have to say without Peter. But if you wanted to leave right now, that would be totally fair.
We'll see you next time, Peter.
All right. Yeah. It's great.
Well, that was something.
Was it a dream come true, Spurg? We wanted it to be a dream come true for you. Chase and I wanted to surprise you with one of your motorcycling heroes. Did it work? Did it live up to the hype?
I am still on cloud 9, if I'm being honest, and I feel like that if I were to retire from motorcycle work tomorrow, this would probably be the high point that I could stand away from.
Wow.
So, yeah. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you, producer Chase. For those of you that might not be familiar with Peter, hopefully now you are. If you want to read any of his work, he has collections out. So actually, if you go to any good book reseller, there's Leanings 1, Leanings 2, Leanings 3. There's a greatest hits you can get. But it's basically, their books are collections of all the work that he did with Cycle World magazine. There's also collections that you can go find of his work for Road and Track as well, if you're a car enthusiast.
Yes, indeed.
But I would encourage anybody out there, start with Leanings, the first book. It's kind of like a greatest hits all by itself. It's a great way to start.
Wicked. So, just another thanks to Peter for joining us. That was a good time. I'm glad you had fun with it, Spurg. I had a great time with it too. Super. I think you and I grew up with our dads sort of maybe not idolizing him, but sort of just looking up to him, right? Like he was the sort of the upper echelon of motorcycle storytellers in my household, because that's how my dad felt about it. And I think your dad is the same. So it's just sort of a surreal moment for us to circle back and be able to talk to someone who has had such an impact on, like our father's motorcycle experience, to such as it is. And therefore our own kind of upbringing. It's a very strange influence he has over us, but pretty fun.
Yeah. Like I said, in my little introduction that was, formally written, but just even thinking about this off the cuff, the magic of his writing was you could picture yourself there. He never presented himself as an elitist or that he was doing something that you two couldn't do. And so when you read his articles, and even as my father would present me with articles, it was like, oh, I can do this.
Right.
And then I did. And then I went out and I bought a motorcycle, and it's like, I can be a motorcyclist too. And I think like that was the magic of it for me. And it was great to be able to finally have a conversation with him. And I hope that maybe your dad will finally tune in to High Side, Low Side and listen, and
maybe,
and hear him. Maybe not
we'll
for
see.
you, but to listen to Peter Egan talk.
I think Peter Egan's a bigger draw to this podcast than I am for my dad. Not that we don't have a lovely relationship, but yeah, I think he would probably get a kick out of that. So we'll see. Maybe he'll tune in. We'll see. It's kind of like Peter said about the sports games. You don't want your family like going too much. I don't want my family to listen to every episode. That would be awkward. So anyway, moving right along, we do have a high side, low side comment to address, and of course a t-shirt to give away, which means selecting an Apple Podcast review. As a friendly reminder, you can go to the Apple Podcast platform. You can leave a review for high side, low side. You can tell us what you like, what you don't like about the program. It helps make the program better. And of course, if we pick one, if you write one that we think is particularly funny, entertaining, whatever, then we'll send you a t-shirt. The winner this time, Spurgeon, is, drum roll. Oh, I thought you were going to say it.
Oh, I'm sorry. You said drum roll. I thought you wanted the drum roll.
No, it was a figurative drum roll. Anyway, Ruoxy 666 is the winner of this episode's Apple Podcast Review Selection T-shirt winning process. Ruoxy 666 says, and I quote, "I am a PhD candidate in physics, and I listened to your show in the lab. My lab mates thought I went crazy when they saw me chuckling so much during my experiments. Even worse, I was too entertained by the podcast and burned several holes in my t-shirt with a laser." That is a sentence I never thought I would read about high side, low side. Ruoxy 666 goes on. "Therefore, your podcast has been banned in my lab to prevent anyone else from going crazy or suffering laser mishaps. By the way, I'm an international student from China. I feel that your podcast is a great way to learn some English." Oh boy.
No.
The speech rate is good. Vocabulary is great. And pronunciation is also great. Maybe. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I really can't speak to that. Anyway, Roxy says, "I wish you all the best in your podcast so I can still listen when I'm ready for my next bike." Very much appreciate this review. Very much appreciate you lacing in this whole story about how you burned holes in your t-shirt and now you ruined a t-shirt and what are you going to do? You're just a poor PhD candidate. You can't afford t-shirts. Well, Roxy, you're in luck. You conned us out of a t-shirt. You're welcome to a free t-shirt. You just have to send your mailing address and preferred size to highsidelowside@revzilla.com and we will send it out to you.
The comment about speech rate, vocabulary, pronunciation, it ties right into the conversation we had with Peter about, having the German immigrant grandfather that comes in and is correcting your grammar. I grew up with my Aunt Susan, and my mom's sister was an English teacher, and God help us if we ended a sentence in a preposition. Like you just got whacked.
I just saw on Instagram, was it your Aunt
Webster's?
Susan? Merriam-Webster. Merriam-Webster just
Yep.
said you can end a sentence in a preposition. There's nothing wrong with that. It was stuck up people that wanted to tie English into Latin, and so they said you can't end a sentence in a preposition, and it's all hogwash. So you can tell your aunt. Was it Aunt Susan?
Aunt Susan, yeah.
Aunt Susan, I'm afraid that Merriam-Webster now disagrees with you, and is it yet another sign of the erosion of our society? Perhaps. I cannot say. The point is, Ruoxy 666, you have a t-shirt coming your way, and we can move on to the high side, low side comment, which has almost nothing to do with Aunt Susan.
Well, no. So ending sentence, it was funny. Like I shared that Webster's Dictionary article with Lance Lightning Oliver, and I said, "What's going on with the world? We're going to have to change the way that we write common tread articles. We're going to have an emergency meeting." And Lance Oliver comes back and says, "You know what Winston Churchill said when someone corrected him for ending a sentence with a preposition?"
This is a great quote.
You know it, right?
I know it. Yeah, but read it for everyone.
And the quote is, "That's the sort of nonsense up with which I will not put." And then Lance went on to say, "Demonstrating the absurdity of going to lengths to avoid ending the sentence with a preposition or with the preposition with." So if it was good enough for Winston Churchill,
That's right.
we're just going to throw it all to the wind, I suppose.
You gotta respect Churchy for being pragmatic. Moving on to the high side, low side comment. This comes in from Jake or Lalu via email. Jake or Lalu says, "As a new rider, I'm looking to acquire my first bike in late winter, early spring." Great timing. This is coming out just in time for you, Wheel. I feel I have a common, but at the same time unique problem. where I don't know the most effective way to prevent my bike from being stolen. I go to a large state university, and my apartment is across the street from a parking structure and is out of visible range. My question, how would you, Zach, and you, Spurgeon, go about securing a motorcycle that is out of line of sight and not frequently checked on? Ended a sentence with a preposition. Anyway,
luckily it's
this is a
okay
good
now.
question.
We're not going to judge you for this one, Jake. But my God, if this would have been 2 weeks ago, whew.
we never would have published this. I think that's in the preposition, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, how do you keep your motorcycle safe, especially when you cannot see it? Spurgeon, what's your shoot from the hip gut instinct here for Lalu?
Jake, I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Reiningsville, Pennsylvania, and I
Right
did
across
not
from a
worry
women's
about.
prison. Oh, sorry. This is your story. My bad. Sorry. You had.
Anyway, there was an adult bookshop actually across the one field, but that not a women's prison. But there was no fear of somebody coming onto the property and stealing the motorcycle. I then moved to Los Angeles 2 years after buying my Triumph Bonneville, and
Where there's also no crime.
I had a newfound fear. First, my insurance rates pretty much quadrupled, and the reason for that was motorcycle theft in Los Angeles was much higher than it was in rural Briningsville, Pennsylvania. So I started by doing two things. One, I got a disc lock, but more importantly, I think the first step for motorcycle deterrent is a motorcycle cover. If people do not know what is there, they're less likely to steal it. Cover it up. Let them know they don't know if it's an old beat up, Honda Shadow or if it's a brand new Ducati, Super Sport S. So I think the first step in deterring anyone from stealing your bike would be a motorcycle cover. Don't let them know what it is. And we're often proud as motorcyclists. We want people to see what we have. But that's my first recommendation is put a motorcycle cover over it. And then, especially now, they didn't necessarily have this when I was first living in LA, but a disc lock with a loud alarm.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. The difference between being out of line of sight and out of earshot are two different things, obviously. So something to keep in mind that if a siren or some sort of alarm going off would make sense, then that's something to keep in mind. And that sort of ties in with my recommendation, which is that I think these are all situational. This like security is obviously different depending on the situation. And you did a good job describing your situation, Lalu, for what it's worth. But you kind of have to you have to be a little bit holistic about this kind of thing. Spurgeon's recommendation for a cover is a great one. I didn't see that coming. I love that, Spurge. As far as actually securing your bike, you got to kind of like look around and see what you think will work. Like if there's something to lock it to, then maybe some sort of burly thing that goes through the swing arm or the rear wheel or something like that. And you can lock it to something. I used to lock my scooter with a kryptonite chain lock, basically. And can you use a grinder to get through it? Yeah. I mean, all any security system is a deterrent, right? Ultimately, a motorcycle can be stolen with tools or a truck or enough people. So there isn't really an end all be all in this situation. You just kind of have to look around and see what you think will work. I would suggest looking for a well-lit corner of the garage, like obviously try to place it somewhere that's sort of, I don't know, in the open and obvious, that kind of thing. I think the siren lock is a decent idea. I think the cover is a great idea. And I think I would just sort of, go old school. If you're genuinely worried about someone rolling it away, then go with try to lock it to something in the garage so that it's much harder to move the machine.
I'm gonna throw out one additional recommendation. Everything Zach said, agree with. There's also expensive motorcycle anti-theft tracking devices and things you can do.
This is a great call.
But you're a broke college. Well, I'm assuming you're a broke college student. If you're anything like I was in college. So get an Apple AirTag. So get a motorcycle cover, get an alarm, lock it to something. But in worst case scenario, if you hide an Apple AirTag under the seat somewhere, and I'm saying Apple AirTag, assuming you have.
If you don't have an iPhone, go buy one of those. Also,
yeah. But it's something where, for $20 you can hide an Apple AirTag under the seat somewhere.
Yeah.
And if something were to happen, you can take your phone to the police. Don't go all, tracking down the criminals by yourself, vigilante on these asses. But like, you can take your phone to the police, and that will help you get the motorcycle back, hopefully, before any damage is irreparably done. Fair
to call out also that some motorcycles do have this feature basically built in, and they're not necessarily expensive motorcycles. I know the CF Moto 450 SS, I think, was the most recent bike I can think of that we experimented with the security system built into the bike, and it's pretty cool. You can link it to your phone, and then the bike will tell you where it is. It's built in, and it will tell you if it's being moved, and you can set the sensitivity, and you can set the app to tell you when someone has moved the bike. And we experimented with this with Awry. Actually took the bike home in his garage, and then I got a notification on my phone that said your bike has been moved. And I texted him. I said, "Hey, you're in the garage moving the bike around. Don't touch that bike." And he texted me back, and he was like, "That's incredible. I can't believe it. I just moved it." So the point is, technology is moving toward ways to keep track of stuff like this. So keep that in mind too. Depending on the kind of bike you're shopping for, it might be built in, or it might be a feature in a motorcycle that would be worth having for you.
Yep, and those systems do. Like I said, those are out there in the aftermarket world, depending on how much you want to spend. So you can start with a motorcycle cover, or you could go to an aftermarket tracking system. So hopefully that, Jake, quote unquote, Lalu, will help point you in the right direction. Just want to take a moment and say, if you have any questions or comments that we have failed to answer, you can always shoot them over to highside-lowside@revzilla.com, and we can potentially pick your comment to read on the air. Leave comments below on YouTube, and if you want to share those engine sound guessing games, you can go ahead and do that. And as always, make sure we actually had a comment on this. Somebody was upset that we were asking people to leave reviews on Apple Podcasts. I saw that comment come through on YouTube. As of right now, that's the only podcasting app that producer Chase, Zach, and I are aware of where you can leave written comments. I just saw that Spotify changed their functionality where you can leave a thumbs up, thumbs down, multi-star review. So you can do that for now, but we're not picking Apple Podcasts because we're trying to support the Apple empire. And I apologize because that's coming right off of my Apple iTag comment, and that's not going to seem like this isn't some big conspiracy for you people out there on the internet. But it does help us if you leave an Apple Podcast review with getting circulation for the podcast. So that's why we ask for it. But I think we came to the end of an episode, Zach.
I sure hope so.
I know that you have asked me a couple times how I'm feeling about this, and I would just say, I want to turn the question to you. How did you feel about today? And were there any takeaways, any, final thoughts about your first time getting to have a conversation with Peter Egan?
My big takeaway is that I didn't know Spurg Sr. was such a bad mechanic. I didn't realize that. Didn't realize he was. I don't. What did you say exactly? You said something like useless idiot. I don't remember the exact phrasing. I guess we can play the tape back, but that's how I remember it. The
thing is,
see that
on
coming.
One hand, my dad is going to be so excited that his question was read out loud to Peter Egan. On the other hand, the setup for how I got to presenting the question is probably not going to be as appreciated around the Dunbar dining room table the next time we talk. I would say towards the middle to end of April.
Fair enough. Well,
but it is a true story that there was. I was staying with my grandmother right after I graduated college. My dad called me and he was like, "Hey, I went to top off the brake fluid in my truck and I accidentally filled it with power steering fluid. I should be fine to drive it, right?" And I was like, "Absolutely not. Stop what you're doing. Back away from the keys." And I had to drive over and bleed his brake system for him. He loves vehicles. He loves riding and driving cars and motorcycles. Right. He's just not, and he likes polishing. Like I was up there over the weekend, he had the Bonneville out and he had it looking spiffed up and shine perfectly. And,
I can represent with this. I can represent with this, Spurg Sr., if you're listening. I'm not a gifted mechanic, and I don't care much for knowing all of the nuances and intricacies of my machine. Mostly I just like riding them around and having fun. So I get it. What about you, Spurge? I'll give you, being that this was your surprise, I don't know, whatever birthday episode we'll call it.
By the time this airs, I will have just turned 41. So you're absolutely right.
What is what's your big takeaway? I'll let you take us out here. Do you have a standout moment from today? I genuinely am having a hard time putting it into words because Peter's work has meant so much to me, and so I think to be able to have a conversation, they say don't meet your heroes, right? And they do.
And I am very happy in the fact that Peter was exactly as I imagined him. He was, a little bit self-deprecating at times, humble, just a genuine enthusiast, somebody that you could picture yourself sitting around and having a beer with at the end of a long motorcycle ride. And I think for us, the thing that I'm most proud of in so much of what we've done in our careers is when we get the comments around high side, low side, and that people will write in and say things like, oh, it sounds like it's just my friends sitting around in the garage having a drink at the end of the ride. And I like that. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I'm most proud of that we've been able to do with this podcast. And the fact that we were able to have Peter on. And to me, it felt like we were just two old friends sitting around telling stories was everything I could have asked for.
You mean three old friends? Because I was there too, right? Is that what you meant?
No. I mean, like,
okay. No, that's
Peter
cool.
was my old friend in this scenario.
Right,
Yeah,
gotcha.
yeah.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
Cool. Yep. Well, that's a great way to end, everybody.
I meant two old friends as in like there was you and there was Peter and there was me. I'm not a friend of myself. I'm my own worst enemy at most times. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a great way to end it, everyone. Please do tune in for the next episode of High Side, Low Side. Who knows what we'll be up to next. We do appreciate your time, and we hope you got a kick out of this episode half as much as Spurge did.
Thanks, everybody.